Hey everyone. Who remembers that happy time in their career, in their life even, when you were just starting out as a software developer? So many big ambitions of building exciting products, learning lots of cool new technologies. Doesn't last long, does it? You end up working on projects where you're creating crazy estimates and building the CTO's pet project, which never gets delivered. But actually for me, when I look back, I don't quite have those happy memories. I look back and I'm kind of, it's a bit awkward because I was a massive expert beginner. Like after just 1 or 2 years, I thought I had everything figured out. I thought I had all the answers. And I'd be with senior engineers, they'd be talking about distributed systems, continuous delivery, all this interesting stuff. And I'd be having my suggestions. Yeah, we should use WCF and Silverlight into the future. Now, it wasn't that I was arrogant, it's just that I wanted to feel important. I saw them doing all of this big, interesting architecture stuff, and I wanted to get involved. And I just found it really frustrating. They were doing all the interesting architecture stuff, and I was fixing their CSS bugs. Not quite where I wanted to be. But one day, I noticed something that would change my career instantly. I walked past the bookshelf, and I saw this book, and I knew right there, this book is going to change my career. I'm going to read this book, and overnight, I'm going to become a senior developer. And this book was called Professional Business Objects. Wow. I want to be professional. I want to do businessy stuff. I want to do all this fancy object stuff in my code. And I was just thinking to myself how fantastic this moment was and how this book would change me. And a senior developer came over, and he said to me, no, don't read that book. It's not for you. Oh my gosh, this book is so good, he doesn't want me to read it. Because he knows if I read this book, he's going to be fixing my CSS bugs. But then he says to me, read this book instead. Domain-driven design. And I was like, what? I don't know anything about design. I'm terrible at design. And he says, no, it's about software design. Just give it a try. If you read this book 10 years from now, you'll be glad you did. Okay, I'll give it a try. I don't know about 10 years from now, 10 minutes from now, I'm reading this book and I'm thinking, what have they done to me? All I'm seeing is tons and tons and tons of verbose Java and UML. Like, what kind of joke is this? So here's my question. Is it possible that 10 years later, I could have learned something from this book and actually that senior developer was right? Is it possible that the young me, the expert beginner, was wrong about something? So actually, there is, and that's why I'm here today. I'd like to talk to you about some things I've learned from this book. But I don't want to talk about my journey and get excited about this book. What I want to talk to you today is, I think there are some insights in this book that are more useful now, this book, Domain-Driven Design. I think there are some insights in this book which are more useful now than they were when the book came out 15 years ago. How can this be possible? Well, let's just take a look at a few of the current trends we're seeing in tech. So firstly, we've got serverless. Anyone using serverless? You will be soon. So serverless has come along, and the cloud providers, AWS, Amazon, same thing, Azure, they're taking away the stuff we care about. They're managing the infrastructure. And so as developers, the things we care about are moving higher up the stack. For most of us, I know some people like playing with Kubernetes clusters. Hopefully it's just a fad, but the future is less infrastructure, more focusing on the business stuff. That's where the industry is going. And when we think about this, and when we look at trends in product management, what product managers have found is the best source of ideas actually comes from talking to customers, but in a very close second place, it's the developers. The best way to build great products is to let the developers and the whole team who are building the product have ideas about the products they're building. And so what we're seeing now in the top companies, the leading companies, is a process called continuous discovery and delivery. We have this one team, cross-functional team, developers, testers, designers, everyone we need in a team, and the whole team is doing discovery. They're going out, they're talking to users, they're doing user research, and the team, including the developers, the whole team is choosing what should we work on, what features should we add to our product, and then they decide to deliver the features they think are most useful. I don't really have time to talk about this today, but here's some excellent books I highly recommend on this topic. But one other thing I'd like to talk about is the kinds of systems we're building. So if we look at the general trend, we're going from bigger monolithic systems to small microservice systems. So there are more pieces in the architecture. But what we're also seeing is that the shape and the type of those pieces is different. It's not just code on a server now. It's all kinds of devices. The last project I worked on, we installed thousands of devices on the streets of New York. This one I'm working on now, I'm working with a company called Navico, and we're building smart boats, devices installed on hundreds and thousands of boats, all pinging data back to the server. It's very different for me from the systems I've worked on, and this is a trend we're going to see continue. And these are the kinds of systems we'll all be working on. Smart fridges, smart lights, smart everything. So, based on these trends that I'm showing you here, I honestly think there are some insights in this book which you'll find really useful. And I'd like to talk to you about them today. And I'd like to start with something called exploration. What's our goal as software developers when we're creating software? It's about two things, in my opinion. Firstly, it's about sustainability, being able to continuously improve the software we're building. No point building a piece of software, hitting a deadline, and you can't improve it in the future. So actually, creating great code is about being able to sustain and evolve a code base over time. But the problem is, that's not an easy thing to achieve. And I've seen things like this before, and this is a true story. Worked at a company, the code base was so bad, they couldn't keep up with the innovation of their competitors. And the code was thrown away, the product was cancelled, and those people were fired. Don't want to touch on that too much. It's not a great moment in my life, but it's a truth. So how do we create evolvable systems? Solid principles. Let's write solid code. Testing, let's test our code. Modularity, let's make our code modular and loosely coupled. These things will make our code sustainable and evolvable. Or maybe they won't, actually, because if you want to create sustainable and evolvable code, it needs to be as simple as possible. I think we can all agree that the simpler something is, the easier it is to change. But if you want to create simple code, you need to represent the business problem you're solving in the simplest possible way. And if you don't understand the business problem well enough, you can't represent it in your code as simply as possible. So we need to understand the domain. And what we learn from this book is the first model we create is always very naive and superficial. And I've encountered this many times. And actually, when we think about refactoring, refactoring isn't just about cleaning up the code. It's about reducing the complexity of our code by making it match more closely with the business domains we're representing in the code. Now, here's the problem. Domain-driven design talks about all of these things about understanding your business. Use it to solve problems in code. But it doesn't really give you any techniques for actually working with the business, which I kind of find a bit frustrating in a way. Like, you're giving us this book about understanding the business, and you're not giving us really any techniques for actually working with the business to understand the domain. I don't consider you a valid solution. We can talk about that later. I did try it a few times, trying to do this UML stuff with business people. That didn't work out for me. Didn't try that again. Meetings. general purpose meetings, getting around a whiteboard, it can work a little bit, but it's not the best format for sharing knowledge when you're trying to get into a domain. So we had this problem in DDD for a very long time. For 10 years, we had this problem where we're talking about, let's understand the business problem, and yet we have no techniques for really understanding the business. And then this guy turns up, Alberto Brandolini, and he starts talking about this crazy thing called event storming. Event storming is this crazy idea that we get developers, business experts, domain experts, we get them all together and we model the business on a wall together so that everyone has a shared model of the system of the domain and they can have conversations about the domain. This is how developers can learn about the business. And the thing about event storming is it's just so incredibly simple. It's like, what were we doing for 10 years? You get an orange Post-it and you take an event from your business. So if you were building a software system for a conference, you might have call for papers opened. And then you model each event in your business process as a timeline. It's pretty simple. It took us a long time to work this out. But think about this, right? Developers can do this. Domain experts can do this. It's a very simple model of your business. Anyone can join in, and we can all discover this domain together and share knowledge. It's really simple and really powerful, and it really does work. But you don't stop with events. Events is just the starting point. You can add commands and users and business policies and external systems and any kind of information you want. So now, as developers, we don't really have an excuse for not understanding the business problem domain we're working in because we have a technique like event storming, which helps us. Helps us understand the business, reduce the complexity in our code. And I'd just like to share with you a few of my personal triumphs with event storming. So, as a fan of domain-driven design, I've always had this desire to get my whole team passionate about the business. That's very easy with event storming. You get everyone in a room with the business experts, with your Post-its, everyone can get involved and start understanding the business. It's very powerful in that way. Think about how you've modeled domains before. I'm guessing normally it's around a whiteboard. How much information can you fit on a whiteboard? Not a lot. With event storming, you can model a whole domain on an entire wall like this and have the whole thing mapped out, and you can start seeing how different parts of the process are linked together, insights you just wouldn't get with another technique. And you can actually get domain experts engaged with you for a long time, maybe some hours. When I talked about meetings before, meetings with domain experts typically don't last that long. It just gets very boring very quickly. And personally, I feel like when I do event storming, I really get into the domains I'm working, and I start asking lots of questions about how the business works, how it should work. And I feel like I'm really engaged on a personal level too. So I don't actually want to tell you that you should all go and learn event storming. I actually want to make you think a bit more wider than this. So there's this quote in the book. I mean, Eric has this quote in the book, but he didn't give us techniques. But he's telling us, he's saying, you should really embrace the domain you're working in. Use it in language and every way possible. And I think what he was trying to say is that we need to find better techniques for understanding the domains we're working in. As technical people, developers, it's on us to find ways to understand the business domain better. And so Alberto says event storming is his pizza. You can put your own topping on there. And it's true. It's exactly what I'm saying. It's go find out some better techniques. Don't stop here. Let's keep looking for better techniques. We love making frameworks. Let's start finding better techniques for understanding the business problem we're working in. He's got a book out called Event Storming, which you might want to check out, but I'm trying to quickly talk about a few other people. So Kenny Bass, Stefan Hoffer, he's working on a technique called domain storytelling. Kenny, he's been combining event storming and example mapping. And Sophia, she's been working on the concept of a domain quiz. where you write a quiz about your domain and challenge your developers to see how much they know. Now, it's not a punishment. It's a way to understand what they know and where their gaps are and help them to improve. Although it could be a punishment if you want to. I don't like punishments, by the way. Well, sometimes I do. Okay, let's talk about something else before I embarrass myself completely. Let's talk about design. So we're software people. We love our rules, our laws, and our principles. There is always a correct way to do something. As a junior developer, I was told, you should write dry code, Nick. Do not repeat yourself ever. Okay, I'm going to never repeat myself. I'm never going to write the same bit of code twice. A few months later, Nick, your code is terrible. Too many abstractions. What, is this thing a rule, a law, or what? What are you trying to tell me? Am I supposed to do this dry thing or not? Next one. Nick, your classes are too big. You should follow the solid principles. All your classes should have a single responsibility. A few months later, Nick, your code is terrible. Too many abstractions. Yagni, one day a senior told me, he's like, oi, Yagni. What kind of insult's that? He's like, you ain't going to need it. You're writing some code that you don't need yet. There's no requirement to solve yet. You're adding a feature that's not needed. Your code is too complex. Okay? Just a few weeks later, I'm working with that same developer. I'm like, hey, Yagni, you're adding a HTTP endpoint and we don't need it yet. He's like, oh, no, I'm allowed to do this because if we don't build this HTTP endpoint now, we won't have time to when the business asks for it later. So now is the last responsible moment. So in software, we have a lot of people who like to think in terms of these rules and laws and principles we should always follow. But actually, there are no rules or laws or principles we should always follow. And what you find when you talk to DDD people is they're very passionate about these things called heuristics. In fact, it's not a rule, it's not a law, it's a principle, it's kind of a clue. Maybe it will work and maybe it won't. Just try it out and see where it gets you. Think for yourself. And so again, in the book, Eric talks about this idea of good modelers, good designers. They're good at taking lots of information. They're good at exploring lots of different ways of modeling a system, not following a simple rule or law, but exploring different ideas and thinking for themselves. And it took me a long time to really grasp this concept, but now I think I can explain it really well. You see, software design is like a supermarket. Who's ever been to a supermarket and not been able to find something because it wasn't where you thought it was? So I recently had this problem, actually. It was a Sunday lunchtime. I had lunch with my wife, and I said, oh, I fancy a dessert. A Viennetta would be amazing. I've not had a Viennetta for like 10 years. Who knows, you know Viennetta, right? The ice cream cake thing. And she said, why don't you get some squirty cream and chocolate sauce? Squirty cream and chocolate sauce on Viennetta. Let's do this. I went down to the supermarket and I was convinced this would be the best dessert I've ever had. And I started looking for the chocolate sauce. So I just walk over to the dessert section, all kinds of desserts and toppings and extras and stars and all this kind of stuff. But actually no chocolate sauce here. Like, why is there no chocolate sauce by the dessert section? Chocolate sauce is a dessert or it's used with desserts. Where could it be? Chocolate, okay, chocolate. Chocolate sauce is a chocolate. So I head over to the chocolate section. I'm seeing like Belgian chocolate, Swiss chocolate, all kinds of fancy chocolate. But no chocolate sauce. So, okay, kind of worried they don't have any now. Maybe it's not the right season for chocolate sauce. Maybe there's a specific season when you can buy chocolate sauce, maybe. I'm like, let's keep this thing going. So chocolate, oh, it's a sauce, right? Chocolate sauce. So I kind of convinced myself it could be a sauce. And I walk over to the sauce section with a lot of doubt in my mind. I start looking around. I'm like, ketchup, mayonnaise, Levi Roots reggae sauce. But I'm not seeing any chocolate sauce here. And now I'm starting to worry. Like 3 places it could have been, and it's not in any of them. So I look for someone who's working there. it takes me a while, and I see this guy who's like super busy, and he's like stacked up with pizzas and pork pies and Scotch eggs, and he really doesn't want me to speak to him, but I really need to find his chocolate sauce. So I'm like, hey, where can I find the chocolate sauce? And he says to me, it's down by the freezers, by the ice creams. But chocolate sauce isn't something you freeze. All that's down there are like 7-foot freezers. It can't possibly be down there. So I'm kind of annoyed. I think he's lying to me. Anyway, I start walking over there, and I'm in like the middle lane. You know how the supermarket has like blocks? I'm like in the middle lane with the aisles on each side. And I walk right down to the end, and I take a left into the ice cream. And I just see big freezers, but right down at the end, I see something. I'm like, what's that thing over there? It looks like an abandoned lunch trolley. And I'm walking, and I get closer, and I'm like, oh my gosh, it's shampoo and chocolate sauce on an abandoned lunch trolley in the ice cream section. And so I was telling my friends about this. I'm like, this is just like software. And they told me to call it the chocolate sauce heuristic. So let's just take a step back for a moment. How could this be about software? So think about what we do in software. It's about taking these different bits of functionality, and it's about grouping them. Which things belong in a class? Which things belong in a microservice? So if we look at these concepts here, how would we group these? Well, we could group them by shape, or we could group them by color, or we could group them by unique combinations. And this is just like software. Things can be combined in different ways because they share different characteristics with different concepts, just like the supermarket and the chocolate sauce, which I think should live with the sauces. But let's get back to software, and let's look at a real example now. So here's a company who built a financial products marketplace. Using their products, you can buy credit card deals, mortgage deals, or loan deals. How do we design this system? Well, it's quite easy, right? The credit cards context, the mortgages context, and the loans context. But actually, what they found was, inside each one of those contexts, there was the same pattern emerging. We have deals for people with a low credit rating, poor deals, high interest rates, some dodgy ethics going on there I don't want to talk about, but then some better deals, people with a great credit rating and a higher score. So now there are two ways we could design this system. By not stopping at the first obvious model, now we've seen two ways, two different characteristics for organizing this system. And so the point I'm making is, when you're designing code or architecture, look for heuristics. Try and use heuristics that challenge your assumptions and make you look at the system in a different way. Because there are always different ways of modeling a system. And until you've looked at the system from multiple perspectives, you can't have any confidence you've got the best solution. And so that's my hidden lesson. That's my hidden lesson. I've worked with people who take this heuristics-based approach. They're not telling me dry, solid. They're telling me, think about your system from this perspective. Why don't you group them from this perspective? And I think that's something we should all be striving towards. The Domain-Driven Design book itself contains a lot of heuristics about language. Look for concepts with the same name. Look for two different things with a different name, which are really the same thing. And there are plenty of design heuristics out there. I'll talk to you a few of my favorite. So the money heuristic. Find parts of your system which are worth the most and organize them together. The marry me heuristic. Awkward time to pause. So the marry me heuristic is not one of mine, but it's basically someone said, if you've got two parts of your code or your architecture, and they're really coupled and they're talking to each other a lot, maybe they should get married and it's just one concept. Or the Valentine heuristic. I was working with a massive supermarket in the UK, and they talked about how they redesigned their complete architecture and their teams, thousands of people. And I said, how could you possibly get this design right? How can you be confident that you've got a good design here? How do you know if you've put the things in the right places? And they said, well, for a lot of it, it was quite obvious. But I'm like, yeah, there are always edge cases where you put one thing in the wrong place and you have lots of dependencies. And they said, well, we played this game and we asked ourselves, which team Or which part of the system would love this feature the most? Who's going to take that feature and develop it to its full potential? Who loves it the most? That's another heuristic. And also about aligning things with the source of change. Thinking back to the finance example, we have different customers who want our system to change in different ways. Maybe instead of organizing by products, we organize by the people, the different people who are asking our system to change in different ways. I've also got another heuristic called the Game of Thrones heuristic. I think I'm running out of time, so I'll leave that one to your imagination. But if you are interested in more heuristics, again, Kenny's working on a site called DDD Heuristics. Evelyn Van Kell is always interested in talking about social heuristics. And Heen is always talking about decision-making heuristics. So lots of people are talking about heuristics. And if you really want to improve as a designer and an architect, I think heuristics are the next good place to go. And we've got some great people in the industry to learn from here, some great mentors. But just one final note. So I was talking to Matthias not too long ago, and I said, do you ever get this thing where you just suggest to your client a very simple idea? Have you tried this? And they're like, oh my God, you're a genius consultant. And he said, yeah, that happens a lot. He said, but I'm not a genius consultant. I just have better heuristics. And that's a quote I live by. I don't need to be the smartest person. I just need to have the best heuristics, so I ask the best questions and I see the best possible solutions that other people don't. Anyway, let's talk about business, because heuristics won't get you all the way to your solution. So heuristics challenge you to look at a problem in different ways, but they don't really tell you how do you choose the best one. What's the best alternative way to design software or architecture in this particular situation? And it depends. But what does it depend on? So domain-driven design gives us this concept of distillation, where we have core, supporting, and generic subdomains. And the idea is you look for your core domains. You look for the parts of your system which have the highest value, and you align your architecture so that you can exploit those core domains best. So if we go back to the financial product example, which was the best solution there? By the products or by the customer? If 95% of your revenue comes from credit card deals, maybe you organize by credit cards and focus on that the most. Maybe that's your core domain. But if your business has 95% of revenue coming from people with low credit rating, and I don't like you if you're one of those companies, but if that's your business model, then maybe you should focus on aligning with that characteristic instead. So you need to understand your business model. If you want to be a good architect or software developer, you need to understand the business model. In fact, how can you actually say to yourself or your colleagues or your team or your boss, how can you say, we've designed this new system and it's the best possible architecture for our needs, if you don't understand the business model? I just don't know how that's possible. I just think you have to understand the business model. And also another related thing I found is we often think of coupling in software as a very technical thing. We look at different parts of the code and see those things which belong together. But actually what you find is when you understand the business, the things that change in your code together will depend on which parts of the business are changing. The tickets and the initiatives you have in your roadmap will influence which parts of your system will be coupled, working on those features. Anyway, one final thing I'd like to talk to you about, and it's not Brexit, it's organization. I would like to talk about Brexit, but not for very good reasons. So organization. A few years ago, I worked in the UK government. UK government doing a big, agile digital transformation, all that kind of stuff. You might have heard of GDS, Government Digital Service. And basically, I was working in a team. I was working with 3 teams. And they were working really well for government teams. It was amazing. We were doing continuous discovery and delivery. We were going out. The whole team was talking to our users, citizens of the UK, and optimizing our system based on what they were asking for. And then one time, the users were telling us, you've just launched a new service, we can't even use it. Like, my address is 5 lines long, and your address fields are 3 lines long. Now, this is a big deal because it was a service for helping you calculate your business taxes, your business property taxes. And if you can't enter your business property address, you can't really do much, and you're stuck back on the old paper-based forms. But that's no problem. We're the software developers. We'll fix it. So we went to make this 3 lines text field 5 lines. But we had a dependency on a back-end team who had a dependency on a database team. And a week later, I'm sitting in a meeting with 5 project managers to put a text box on a web page. I'm a little frustrated, and it didn't work out. We couldn't do it. Teams are too busy. They got 6-month release cycles. Getting all of these teams to work together is impossible. So that was a bit of a not a great moment in my career, actually. I was maybe not quite like this, but I was quite sad. But after this, it motivated me to try even harder. So I started talking to senior management in the government agency. I'm like, look, we have all of these problems. We can never release simple things like adding a text box. We need to work more effectively. We need to change our system so that teams can implement very simple features very easily. No one listened to me. No one listened to me, and I was upset and had some more moments. And then, out of the blue, one day, I received an email, and it said, there's going to be a meeting next week about those topics you've been talking about. Oh, okay. Maybe they will finally listen to me after all. So I get to the meeting, CTO's there, lots of big people there, and the CTO says, programmers are too slow, they're a liability. We've just bought a rules engine and a BPM system, so we don't need programmers. Okay. Not the result I was looking for in that situation. I must admit, I wasn't feeling too happy that day. But let's get this back on track. What was the problem here? The problem was, we had a software architecture that looked like this. We needed 5 teams to put a text box on a web page. Once they introduced their new BPM and rule system, now we needed 6 teams to put a text box on a web page. That's the kind of pain I went through. But my point is, we often talk about microservices having these lots of small pieces. But we're just making our architecture more complicated sometimes. It's not about the size or the number of those pieces that matters. And you often hear people talking about microservices should be bounded contexts. But they're kind of the same people who are creating these big, complicated architectures. And if you look in a domain-driven design book, if you look, the answers were there 15 years ago. Like, if you read that section on bounded context in the domain-driven design book, it's all about teams. It's about creating loosely coupled systems which enable teams to work independently and make changes quickly. And if you look, there were all kinds of quotes. The shape of the architecture must be reconciled with the shape of the organization. It's all about the problems emerge when teams aren't organized the right way. All about teams. So the lesson here is that when we're designing software systems, we really have to think as much, if not more, about the teams who will be building and maintaining those systems. And that's what bounded contexts are. They're a socio-technical construct. But don't take my word for it. Nicole Forsgren, Jez Humble, Gene Kim, they've been doing the DevOps surveys for the past 4 or 5 years. They've surveyed thousands of companies. And guess what they found? The biggest predictor of continuous delivery performance was a loosely coupled software architecture and an organizational structure to match. The biggest predictor was getting your architecture and your team design right. But don't take their word for it. ThoughtWorks did their studies too. And what they found is the shape of the teams matters a huge deal. When a piece of work leaves the team, when multiple teams must collaborate on a single piece of work, It takes an order of magnitude longer to complete that piece of work. And if you're having lots of small microservices and lots of small teams, just think about that. What are you actually doing here if you get your boundaries wrong? So the hidden lesson is quite clearly that software architecture isn't really a thing. It's socio-technical architecture, thinking about technical boundaries and team boundaries collectively as one thing. So I'm almost done now. I'm just going to recap on what we talked about during this talk. So firstly, I think the first takeaway is be passionate about your domain, but let's try and find better ways of understanding the business domains we're working in. Techniques like event storming and domain storytelling. Let's get excited about these techniques as much as we get excited about frameworks, for example. Secondly, we are building systems which are complex in different ways. More pieces, different types of pieces, different kinds of devices on boats and fridges and all these kind of things. Simple laws and rules don't work here. Dry, Yagni, these aren't things we can just follow simply. Solid, we can't follow them simply. We need heuristics that help us to think about how can I look at this problem in a different way and create different solutions to this problem. And then if we want to start answering those questions, like which is the best solution here, you need to understand the business model. Really, if you don't understand your business model, how do you know you've got the best architecture to solve your business problems? And finally, it's all about being socio-technical. If we start making our software architectures more complex, we can make it even harder for the teams building those systems to get work done. So let's just think about that. So my summary is that based on the trends we're seeing and the ones I talked about earlier, I think that software developers in the future, or I'm convinced, software developers in the future will be more product and business focused, and they will be socio-technical thinkers, thinking about the shape of their teams and their software and providing more focus there. But that's just my thinking of how things could go. It's really up to you about where you want to take things. Maybe you think I'm wrong. So I'm currently working at Navico. If you're looking for a job, we're hiring. Apart from that, I'm finished. Thank you very much.